Well, friends, welcome, welcome, welcome. This is our final session together. Matt, are we online? We're online. Okay. So this is our final session together on our class, Jesus and Jubilee. We did a great job, I think, this year as a church of trying to make sure our schedules were all carefully aligned, and today is literally the only day where we have a conflict in the entire calendar, which I think we probably deserve some kudos, but that's one of the reasons, yeah, thank you. But that is one of the reasons why we have a smaller group today. And of course, you are all the intrepid, stay with it folks. So I deeply appreciate that. They're serving food, yes, that's right. And you get a chance to learn about very important ministry partners who are working around the issues of, yes, that's right, food insecurity. Thank you, Jeff. Did you want the mic? Should I give you the mic? Oh, okay, thanks. So what we're going to do today is I'm going to kind of give you something of an overview of what we have gone through. This is, of course, a class that's based on my book, Jesus, Jubilee, and the Politics of God's Reign. And I feel like we've done a pretty good job of distilling the main points in the book, the things that I think are the highlights that are important. You can, of course, and I would encourage you to get your own copy and read if you want some more of the details and sort of data. But I think you've gotten a pretty good swath of the argument of the book. In a sense, today brings the discussion kind of to where the rubber meets the road, we might say, right? So if Jesus, right, embodies Jubilee, embodies kingdom, well, what does all this mean for us? And that's kind of the direction we're going to be heading today. So, and in that regard, what I think I have to say is not all that groundbreaking. It's simply, hopefully, provocative for you. So what I want to do is kind of remind us of what we've learned so far. For those who have been here, this will be a helpful just kind of reminder on this first day of daylight savings time. We need a little extra reminders. And for others, if you've been kind of here on and off, it'll help you fill in some of the blanks perhaps. So what have we learned so far? So if you remember, the book is about Jesus and the kingdom of God. And I began the book with an exploration of the book of Psalms, in part because this is where God's kingship and kingdom are talked about in the Old Testament, sort of in the most sophisticated fashion. And one of the things that I noted there and that we discussed is that God is often portrayed as on the throne, and the throne being rooted in righteousness and justice. And so we talked through, well, what is God's righteousness? What is God's justice? And I think the basic idea was that righteousness is not a sort of abstract character quality. Rather, it has to do with when people are living righteously, that means they're living faithfully with other people, right? So God keeps faith, essentially, is what that means. So when God's righteousness shows up, that's God essentially keeping faith. And what God is keeping faith with is both us, but also God's intention that creation, that we as creatures and creation itself would not only have life, but it would have a flourishing life, right? So God's righteousness then is God's commitment to the flourishing of creation, that this is something that God willed, we might say, in the act of creation itself, and something that God remains committed to. We also, of course, noted that, and we did this in one of our first exercises, right, that we don't often find in the world all the time places where flourishing life is made possible. And so justice is the address, or the redress, we might say, of where that flourishing goes wrong. So righteousness and justice together they make up what it means for God to rule, God's reign, and they also have to do with the flourishing creation and a flourishing human community. We then, in the next session together, we traced and tracked and kind of mapped basically how these concepts of God's reign as righteousness and justice is expressed through the legal legislation of Israel in the book of Leviticus, and in particular, the Jubilee legislation that we find in Leviticus 25. And essentially what we went through there was a discussion that Jubilee is a great expression of God's righteousness and justice, because what happens in Jubilee is that basically there's a kind of social and economic reset that was supposed to happen every 50 years in the life of Israel, in which those who had sold themselves into slavery were to be set free. Those who were, trying to struggle, live under debts, were to be forgiven. And very importantly, people who no longer had access to land, which in the ancient world would have meant essentially life or death, that they would be given access to that land back. So Jubilee in that regard becomes a great expression of God's commitment to righteousness and justice. It essentially envisions the conditions for a flourishing life in the ancient world. And there are some gestures that we find, and I kind of talked a little bit about these, right, of release, reversal, and repair. That these seem to be kind of, I think, a central way of talking about what does Jubilee look like, what are the kind of basic ideas, right? Release here is the same, that word I mentioned to you in the Greek at least can be translated as also forgiveness. So release of bondage and forgiveness of debts are in some ways the same thing but from different angles, right? Reversing the situation that people find themselves in, and ultimately all of these things move towards repair, right? The work of purification has to do with the fact that Jubilee begins on the Day of Atonement. And we talked through a little bit about that in the legislation in Leviticus 25, which I know everyone in this room has now memorized at this point. But basically, I think the vision there was you have a cultic moment in which the people essentially set themselves right before God, or God sets them right in and through the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, which begins then Jubilee. And I think the basic idea is that you go through this process of the rites of Yom Kippur, which are sort of, in the abstract, they set you right, and then you live into Jubilee, and the relationships are really genuinely set right. So that's kind of the way that we put those together. We then left the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible. We moved into the New Testament. So in week 4, we began to map Jubilee onto Jesus. And what we spent our time doing was simply talking through the ministry of Jesus and the ways in which Jesus can be seen releasing, reversing, and repairing. And we had a couple of examples of that. And of course, at the end, we ended with recounting Luke chapter 4, where Jesus announces his ministry by literally quoting from a prophet, Isaiah, who was quoting from Leviticus 25. So Jesus literally talks about his ministry as an expression of Jubilee. So that was kind of what we spent our time there. So for us then to see that the reality that Jesus was committed to, right? The thing that maybe we might say defined him in his ministry was Jubilee, essentially. And that as an expression of, we might say, again, God's kingdom. We then turned for the last couple of weeks, and we talked about the fact that Jesus's mission, this beautiful vision, all along the way meets resistance. And so we talked through, right, the crucifixion in a sense as the culmination, not as the only place, but literally as the culmination of a series of experiences that Jesus has. Like one of the great examples, right, is Luke 4, where Jesus announces himself as the prophet who's bringing Jubilee. Only by the end of this scene are the people of Nazareth, they're trying to throw Jesus off a cliff, right? So from the very beginning, essentially, there is resistance to this. And we talked through the levels of resistance. We noted that there's human resistance. We noted that there's what we might call ideological resistance, and then, of course, the resistance of the powers of sin and death, right? That there is something spiritual that is far beyond human beings, essentially, to control, confront, or resolve. So resistance is key and was key in the life and ministry of Jesus. The crucifixion, in a sense, is an example then, or we might say it's the exemplar of the creation's refusal to live into God's Jubilee vision. At the same time, we noted, and I kind of used this language of apocalypse, we noted that the confrontation that happens on the cross, and we might even say the confrontation that happens throughout the ministry of Jesus, is not simply Jesus being rejected, but also God showing up to confront that resistance. But the way that God confronts that resistance is in the form of suffering love. And so I wanted to kind of highlight for you here again that God expresses God's reign not by being the biggest, baddest, MFer on the block, to use an expression that I don't know if I'm allowed to use in church. God does not squash the bugs, right? That's not how God reigns and expresses. Rather, God suffers. And in and through that suffering, love overcomes. And so the very mode of confrontation itself is nonviolent and is life-giving, we might say. So Jesus is not the only person on trial, and the means by which God overcomes is that suffering love. And then last week, we ended our discussion with a consideration essentially of the resurrection. And part of what I was trying to make straightforward for us was that Jesus' embodiment and commitment to Jubilee is not something that's just locked away in the past. And the reason that we can say that, I think, is because Jesus himself lives. And what lives is not just a corpse or the personality of Jesus, but rather the shape of his life. So resurrection has to do with a form of life being shown to be more powerful than death. Sometimes this, I think, has been used in a phrase that love is stronger than death. And in this case, we can see that in the person of Jesus. So Jesus' Jubilee way is stronger than death. So today what I want to do essentially is talk about how that now is shared with us. That's poured out on us. This is, again, the last chapter in the book, and the last kind of really half of the chapter, that last chapter. So our learning target essentially is pretty straightforward, I think, but I can understand the outpouring of the Spirit as God's invitation to all people to live into God's Jubilee. And I would assume that most of you who kind of been walking along by this is probably not very surprising that this is the direction that we're going to go. So I have a little bit of material I'm going to move through, and then we're going to spend a good bit of the last part of our time on a couple of exercises that we have in the room. I have my beautiful and wonderful partner, Jubilee Winn, back, who her voice is a little bit hoarse because yesterday we spent the whole day singing karaoke because today is her birthday. So that's right, lots and lots of birthday kisses and hugs and whatnots. So, all right, so the last thing then to talk about is the Spirit. And again, as I've mentioned before, these are not the only ways to interpret the ministry of Jesus, the cross that Jesus encounters, the resurrection, and certainly the Spirit. It's just one particular angle. But in the New Testament, the resurrection of Jesus and the giving of the Spirit, or the power of the Spirit, are typically very tightly bound together. And the Gospel of John in particular especially makes this connection. Basically, this scene in John chapter 20, I'm not going to read it for you, 19 through 23, Jesus encounters the disciples, the risen Jesus, and the first thing that he does is he breathes upon them. And he says, as he breathes upon them, receive the Spirit. So the idea of the risen Jesus giving some kind of gift to the disciples in the form of the Spirit is central, I think, to the story of Jesus and, of course, also the story of the followers of Jesus. In other words, we don't just try to follow after Jesus because we think he's an interesting personality. Somehow there is something that has been given to us that kind of compels us, maybe shapes us in the way that we seek to follow. Now, there are certain traditions that play that up, and that experience has to be, filled with speaking in tongues and other kinds of things. That's not what I'm trying to say. I'm simply saying that there is a gift that is given to us. And that gift, I would suggest, is the form of life that Jesus was committed to, right? Now, Paul describes Jesus as a life-giving spirit in chapter 15. And in that context, what I think Paul is arguing, and I make this argument again in the book, and if you want to see all the details, you can buy the book for $9.95 just down the hallway. I'll give you a discount and even write down my name, give you the John Hancock. I'm just kidding. But what is offered here is, I would suggest, the Jubilee-shaped life of Jesus. That part of what's poured out on not only Christians, I think, and here's where I'm a little bit more of a, maybe outside the box, but I think that God pours out this Spirit on everyone. But the question is, will we all live into it? And I think some of us do. And even folks beyond, of course, the confines of the church also live into it. What is it that's given? And basically, again, in the book, I highlight 4 gifts that are typically associated with the giving of the Spirit. And we don't need to have all these details, but my point is that there are different angles to this. There are different facets to this diamond. One is the gift of light. And so the Spirit and light are often associated with one another. And light here is not just daylight, it's the ability to see things, right? So the ability to actually see. Well, what is it that we come to see? Well, at least one thing, not the whole, but at least one thing we come to see is the shape of Jesus' life. We come to see that this was what he was really committed to. This was what he died for, right? The Jubilee. So we get to discern, we come to discern the actual shape of who Jesus was, is, and will be. The next gift that the Spirit gives, we can find this listed in Galatians that talks about the gifts of the Spirit, and that is love, neighbor love, we might say. The gifts of the Spirit are recounted in Galatians chapter 5, 22, 23. If you've grown up in the church, you probably know, right? Love, joy, peace, patience, etc. Well, typically, that very first word, love, can also be understood as the gift that God gives and that proliferates the others. That if you have love, that's the basis for having joy, peace, patience, etc. So neighbor love, the commitment to others, the commitment to your neighbor, this is something that the Spirit enables us to actually be committed to. Because human beings, we really only want to care for us and ours. Like we're kind of built that way in a sense. And this is what enables potentially us to transgress those boundaries, to go outside of ourselves, and maybe even to be drawn outside of ourselves. And I just finished this last year teaching through the book of Acts. It took about a year and a half to get through it. And one of the most interesting things about the book of Acts is not how together the church has its act, but in fact how not together it is. And how, in fact, oftentimes the church is being asked to catch up with what God is doing. And typically what God is doing is going outside of the acceptable boundaries for who should belong and who should not belong, et cetera, et cetera. So this idea of neighbor love, I think we see some interesting trajectories in other places. Connected to this, right, where the Spirit of the Lord is, there's freedom, right? So freedom, and I would suggest here that I'm kind of putting a little Bonhoeffer spin on this, but it's freedom for others. It's not so much freedom from, even though that is, I'm sure, also a part of the gift, but it's rather especially freedom for others, right? To become more available to God, to our neighbors, to the earth, to ourselves. And then lastly, I think, is the gift of life. The Spirit is oftentimes associated with God's gift of life. And if we read this through the lens that we've been developing in the class, I think what we come to is that the Spirit doesn't just give sort of life in general or even just spiritual life, but rather the possibility of having a flourishing common life. That's what God is interested in communities, in people who are able to flourish together and to ever and ever and ever have their boundaries extended. That seems to me to be the direction. So it is the Spirit then by which God is beginning to spread the kingdom or the Jubilee-shaped life of Jesus, right? It's being poured out into the world, looking for partners. Now, let me stop there for just a second to see if my trusty companion would like to come forward. So I have another category that I was thinking about introducing to you, but I think I'll save it so as not. I've given you more than enough to process with this material. But one of the questions most natural question is, well, how do we actualize this gift that we've been given? How do we imagine Jubilee and our role of helping to spread God's Jubilee in the here and now as this community? And so this is where Jules is going to now take over and walk us through.
Okay. Good morning. Oh, a microphone would really help me today in all walks of the day because my voice is very, very torn up from singing hard last night. Okay. So just to kind of say it another way, and this is an image we were talking about a few weeks ago. This idea of Jubilee in terms of God, he's thinking about righteousness, which is faithfulness to this thriving creation, right? That everyone has access to a thriving life. And that is what his hope is, and that is what he's always wanting. And his righteousness is that faithfulness to that vision. And the world, however, as we know, is broken. There's brokenness in the world. And then the idea of Jubilee is the return to wholeness. That's justice. How do we return, try and get closer to that thriving life again? So this kind of motion we started to explore a few weeks ago. If you remember, around the room, like over here, you can kind of see, we did a brainstorm where we said, okay, so the lives of children, what are some of the ways that it gets broken? And we started to think about that. What does it look like when it's thriving? Lives of children, they have good, nourishing food. They have housing. They are growing. They are healthy, right? But what are some of the things that can break that down? Access to health care, housing and location, segregation, racism. There's a lot of things that break that beautiful continuum for kids and cause brokenness. So what we see should be true for children, and what's actually true is kind of where we stopped that conversation as we were brainstorming. So today we're going to continue it with something called a carousel, a brainstorming carousel. So what that's going to look like is this. We have these original documents that you guys made. And then we have a blank piece of paper next to it. You all have access to markers. So what you're going to be doing is we're going to have everyone in a few minutes get up and go find one of these places. And actually, Rick, would you stand up and model this with me? Grab a marker. Surprise. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask a question. And the question I'm going to start with is, what are things that you can do personally that could affect this in some way? So this particular one is environment and health. So I might say, there's one down here on waste and garbage. So I might say, recycle. And then I'm going to go to the back of the line, and then Rick is going to step up. And he's going to put whatever he's going to put. So just pretend like he's writing something. Yeah. Create pollinator gardens. Right? And then maybe I'm going to come up here and I'm going to say something about like don't waste water, like, right? Turn off faucets or something. So I'm not wasting water. Faucets. So anyway, it would go round. Thank you so much, Rick. So it will go round like that. Like you just step up, write a thing, go to the back. And then the next person comes up, writes a thing, and then go to the back. And we're just going to be kind of brainstorming about what we can do personally. After a couple minutes, then I'm going to have you guys pause and move to a different one. And we're going to keep building on what has been given there, okay? And then after like a round or two of that, then I'm going to give you a slightly different question. And we'll continue on. So every time as you arrive at a new place, you're going to be able to see what other people have written, and you can add on. Now, there will come a point where you might not have a lot more to say, like a lot of good things have already been added. So when it's your turn to come to the front, if you don't have something new to add, you could just check something that you agree with. And you're like, yeah, that's something I could do, and you're going to resonate with that. Does that make sense? Okay, so there are 5 locations. There is this one, which Rick and I have graciously started for you. There's this one on the door. There's this one on this back wall. These walls are very hard to stick these things to. And so rather than stick them all over the windows and stuff, then I have one here and one there. Okay, and it doesn't matter where you go, but you're just gonna kind of create a line, and when we say go, you're just gonna start rotating through for a few minutes. Okay, any questions?
Okay, go.
Okay, grab your favorite color marker. Find a spot. Oops. No, you still have more time. That was just something else. Don't worry. One thing I should have said is that try not to talk. Just because what you're doing is you're processing. And when I used to say to my kids, when you share your ideas around you, it creates a leaky bucket. So then you get up to the front of the line and you're like, what was I going to say again? And so if you are quiet and you hold it in your head, your bucket is full, and then when you get out there, you have something to put down. So don't be a leaky bucket. You stay with the same poster for another 47 seconds. Nope, you're not supposed to have moved. Nope, just stay where you are and you keep going up to the same poster until I say stop, and then you move to a new one. Okay, now you can take your marker and finish whatever it is you're writing, and you can move. You don't have to stay with the same group. You could go to a new group and pick a different poster, and I'll give you a few minutes at that one. microphone. Sorry. Okay. If you have not, please move to another thing. And this time I'm going to have you change the question a little bit. The question I'm going to have you answer this time is going to be, what actions can the church take, can we collectively take to help bring some of these things back to a Jubilee state? So this was, and you can still, of course, write on your next poster individual actions that can be taken that each one of us can do. But then there's also something about collective action. What would that look like if a group of people came together and were able to powerfully address some of this stuff? So again, if you can't come up with anything new, feel free to check mark something that resonates with you. We're just going to take a little bit more time, and then we'll debrief this. Okay. Let's do one more switch to one last poster and see if you can come up with any last things. And after this one, we will be done with this part of it. You guys are just coming up with some really beautiful ideas. essentially tap. Yeah, yeah. Yeah. That's a good one. Okay, as you finish writing your last things, now I'm going to invite you to do a little bit of a gallery walk. A gallery walk is just walking around to all the places you've been and to the places you haven't, and reading what people have written. So this is just a way for us to now take in all this beautiful information that has been gathered. So walk around, read through, take in what has been said, and then when you're done, come back and have a seat. And that's how we'll know we're ready to start again. Yeah, if you see something you want to affirm or something you want to add, absolutely, you can still do that. When you're done and you've seen everything, you can go ahead and have a seat back at your table. Okay. So, as we wrap that up, does anyone have any ahas or things that they noticed about the activity that they would want to share out in terms of that experience. What was that like for you, or what things did you go, wow? What came up?
Sue?
On the environment issue and what the church could do, I'm impressed as I look around our creation care efforts, and I would love to see more partnership of, we have a cabin up north, we've got little baby white pines that are gonna, never survive, and we could bring trees home, and then we could even get preschool. The Berry Patch has kids that are going to be wild berries, and they're going to be trying to do things more outdoors. We could have them have a tree that they plant and watch it grow. We could do a lot of things in partnership, I think, that would have an impact on our beautiful creation living right here, and that would impact and teach a lot to little ones and to all of us, that we can work together and have an impact on our environment.
Yeah, so my thoughts were a little more general on kind of the feeling I was getting, but I thought it was just very encouraging to see the very open ways people are thinking about a lot of these issues, because I feel like at least for me in daily life, there's so much resistance to thinking about how we live and how we are in the world. So to just see such an open platform and so many different unique ideas was just a cool thing to see.
Thank you. And I'd like to say too, just like that's a big deal, because our kids, and Benjamin's out of high school now, but I can tell you, anybody who's involved in education, and I'm sure you've all heard it, the mental health crisis for our young people is pretty profound. It's pretty catastrophic, and it's not just because of, I don't know, the mental health things are on the rise accidentally. Think about the news they hear every day about the world is dying and people hating each other and wars and all these things. And they hear it, even though we have all lived through different things, they hear it, they're bombarded with it in every area constantly. At least when we were growing up, we had a little bit of buffer, and there was a little bit of sweet child experience growing up, and you could kind of lose yourself in the joy of that time of life. But for our young people, it is a pretty discouraging place to be. And so of course there's going to be anxiety and depression and all kinds of stuff. And so so it's important that they hear messages of hope, but also see that people care about it too, and hear that it's not the end of anything. God has his hand in it, and we're part of that. So thanks for sharing that. Does anyone else have anything they wanted to say about ahas or anything that they experienced? Yes.
No, I was just talking with Julie ahead of time. I think globally, or at least within the U.S., we're entering a period now of the election where we're going to be dividing more firmly into camps, and that's kind of against the spirit of Jubilee. We've got our thing, and we want to win, and then we're going to do this, and you're going to do that, and there's more contentiousness building up and I think it's supported in a way on both sides politically, and that creates an environment that's not life-giving.
Yeah. Oh, here we go. Pete's going to say.
I just want to echo that point, because I think it's a really great point about the polarization, and yet all of this stuff that we wrote down that we could do individually or together, I think people on both sides could do it, Republicans and Democrats. I honestly, there's very few issues that I saw as partisan issues. They all seem like things we could all do as people, children of God. So I find that very inspiring for a possibility of Jubilee unity.
Yeah.
I think also going along with that, and I like work on campaigns and stuff, and a lot of the things that I like see on here, there's already legislation here in Minnesota, across the country, that's like happening, or somebody's been trying to make it happen for like 10 years. There are a lot of ways where you can, like, if you feel passionately about something, just like Google it and find a way to like plug into the organizations that are like pushing for those things. Because one of the things I thought about with Lives of Children was, well, you could pay off a school lunch debt. Well, as of this year, kids in Minnesota don't have that anymore in schools. If they're in, you know, in a public school, like their lunch is covered, which is great. And that's an amazing thing that happened. And I know the people that worked on it for like years and years and years, and it was their whole issue. And it took a lot of work. It took a lot of fighting. And whether you agree with it or not, like there was so much on the back of that, that now kids in Minnesota get, you know, they're not hungry when they're at school, which is amazing. And you think about like all these environmental issues. There are just so many ways to very easily plug in, and people that are already doing the work, you don't have to like any of these things that we feel passionately about. There are probably already people doing that work, and so you don't have to start from scratch, which is really helpful in a lot of ways. So if that makes sense.
Doing your part, yeah. Well, and I think you both raise an interesting point, and because no one, I don't care what side of the divide you're on, no one is going to look at a starving child and not feel something. No one is going to look at that and be like, oh, that's fine, I don't care. If they're confronted with it, if they really have to look at it, they're going to feel something. And like, I think this brokenness is visible. And I think everyone wants a better world. Everyone would want to see that child fed. But like, it's all these dotted lines of how. That's politics. How do you want to do it? Well, this is how I think we could do that. Well, this is how I think we could do that. And it's a question of the right way forward to help feed that starving child, right? And so I think if we can keep that in mind, like we all see this and we all want the same thing, then if we can get our motives straight in our head, then these conversations about the tactics, about how you do it, I think become easier to have, because you're in agreement on something right off the bat. So anyway, these are so beautiful, you guys, so I'll hand it out back to you, but it's really beautiful.
Yeah, so here we are then, the final session, and first thing I'd just like to say is thank you so much for participating, for being here. If you were able to be here for all the sessions, that's great. If you could only make it for some. If you're interested in learning more, if you miss sessions, they are available on YouTube. And there'll be basically each session has some content in it, and then we do some activities. Jules and I kind of were working hand in hand to make this thing come alive. I think at the end of the day, my own hope, and one of the deep reasons that I wanted to write this book, or maybe that I figured out why I was writing it as I was going along, is that I believe that God lives and that God is at work in the world. And I want to know where God is working so I can join in. And so I felt like I needed a criteria by which to discern what does that look like. And Jubilee, it seems to me, is a really good criteria for discerning what does God's work look like. It is life-giving. It is encouraging of growth. It is for a flourishing life. And so my hope for us as a community is that we also, I hope that you find some components of this useful as you think about the different individual possibilities. I've taken pictures of all these. I'm going to show them to Jeff. And I'm hoping that maybe we can inspire some new strategic initiatives potentially. We are in the middle of, I think, sort of on the back end now of articulating the vision for our church and beginning to think about the strategic priorities of how we're going to go about ministering. So you have provided some more additional inputs that are going to go into that process. And so I thank you for that. Are there any concluding comments or questions that you might have? Well, with that, let's all go home and take a nap. Let me say a prayer and dismiss us. I will say we won't be having Sunday school until we get up into April, because I'll be out of town next week, and then we have Holy Week coming up, and then but Sarah will be coming back. Actually, she'll be doing a Sunday school to conclude her time here with us, as you know, and so I encourage you to consider coming for her sessions, which will be in mid-April. And then we will also be welcoming back our guest speaker, who's been here before, Lori Brandt-Hale. She does work in interfaith engagement and dialogue. She does work on Bonhoeffer, and she's spoken here before, so I hope you'll consider attending that. She'll be here in May. So, but let me say a quick prayer as we prepare to go forth. Lord, we thank you for the gift of creation, for the gift of life, and for your intention that not only should we exist, but we should have a flourishing life. May we, Lord, live into that as best as we are able, and in the ways that others struggle, may we come alongside and assist them that they might have flourishing lives. May your Spirit be in places where we can't be, bringing forth fruit, bringing forth true abundance. May violence and warfare be ceased and stopped so that people might live. We ask and pray all these things and pray for your blessing as we go forth. In Jesus' name, amen.